In any case, my talk today will deal with the Afro-American influence on classical music. The words classic and classistic are frequently applied to music, but for the most part, they are used in an indefinite variety of ways. The first definition that we have for what is classic usually pertains to the architecture of ancient Greece and Rome, from the age of Pericles and so on, that deals with the architectural structure. And we in music always like to say that architecture is frozen music. Classic music in its narrowest sense, after this sense of architecture, of the Greek orders, the Corinthian, the Ionic, and the Doric columns. In the next definition comes about in 1750 to 1825, and that has to deal with music, principally the form and structure of the compositions of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. So it in its narrowest form. When I said it's used indefinitely, that some of Schubert's music is classic and other parts is romantic. Some parts of Beethoven's music is extremely classic, and then some of it is bordering on being very romantic, and even Haydn, who is at the very forefront of this classical period, some of his music in his string quartets, late string quartets, becomes to be extremely chromatic. By chromatic, have you been to chromaticism in the class? You know, in tonal music, you have one pitch that's related tonally with the tune that ends at a specific place, at da-da-dee-dum-bum, and then you can clap and applaud and everyone can go home. And those are in the chromatic system or the 12-tone system, there are 12 pitches on the piano, only 12. And all of the rest of the pitches are higher or lower versions of those 12. But the conductor or the singer only has at his command to use 12 pitches on the piano. So the term classic carries the connotation of excellence, clarity, proportion, dignity, and beauty. The composers who exemplify that, of course, are Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Now, my second definition is one of a musical work that counts as classic when it manages to intensify and to epitomize, or to look at that as the highest ideal in a convincing statement and an enduring shape that forces the expression and form, that is the construction of music, at work in its own historical context. So first we had the context of the Greek and Roman orders and antiquity. Next, the term becomes enlarged to include the work from 1750 to 1825 musical compositions. And then later, with modern music, it is looked at in terms of the expressions of jazz and jazz opera, all included in this 12-tone system, and also using the forms of blues and jazz and spirituals inside of that structure and context. So it becomes broadened. It's the second definition that I'm going to address this morning. This morning you will hear three compositions. One will be, the first one, a work by Antonín Dvorak, who was born in Prague in September 1841 and died in the 1st of May in 1904. This composition is called the Symphony in E minor, and we already have the key when we say minor, the key when we say minor. Ta-da-ta-da-ta-ta. I can't resist it. My students at where I teach have become accustomed to me, and they just wait for my little jokes and so on. And then finally I tell them, okay, you can applaud now. Here's another joke when it goes whizzing right by. But uh, I look at all of this in terms of not only being weighty and serious and for exams and the notes, but I look at it also in terms of enrichment and for pleasure, for pleasure. Um, so that's what we are going to hear. The symphony in E minor, Opus 95, and you may recognize Opus from the comic strip character. But opus is a word that means work. The work number 95 called From the New World. And I'm going to say a little about Dvorak at this point. Uh, it was said, Dvorak said, that these beautiful and varied themes are a product of the soil. They are American. They are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them. In the Negro melodies of America, I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music. And he's talking about including folk melodies, folk songs, as Aaron Copland did with Hoedown and in his Old American Songs and Music, put folk music into a classical mold or a classical structure, okay? Not only did he do that, but we find examples in Franz Schubert's work called Die Schöne Millerin, or the Beautiful Miller's Maid, who took the folk songs of Germany and Austria and put them in a classical context. Another one is called Heidenröslein, the thorn of the hedge, which was a German folk song, and then put into a classical mold and structure. So there's a historical basis for this whole flow. Dvorak wrote two other works in which he used themes employing the idioms of the Negro spirituals, the so-called American Quartet, Opus 96, and a quintet, Opus 97. Then he returned to Bohemia in 1895, leaving an awakened interest in this music. Also influenced was Edward MacDowell, the composer. Of course, you know the MacDowell Colony in Peterborough, New Hampshire, where Professor Soulos and I have also made one of our great appearances. Dvorak was particularly fond of his black students, and one of them was a man named Harry T. Burleigh, who was not only a great baritone, but also a composer, and who took Negro folk melodies, what we call Afro-American religious folk songs, or what is commonly known as the Negro spiritual, and set them to music. The folk songs are songs, the definition for folk songs are those songs that spring from the hearts and the minds and the souls of the people and have no individual author. They're not written down by anyone. And so the composer listens to this music, and then he provides an accompaniment in a classical form suitable for public performance. That also carries with the connotation of it practice. Work, 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 and the miracle happens. And so Dvorak had Harry T. Burleigh sing night after night and night after night of these spirituals, and he put these melodies and his idioms in his composition. You will hear the first musical idea of this excerpt that I'm going to play. It became a very popular song called Going Home. Going home, going home, I am going home. Okay, and Paul Robeson, the great baritone or bass baritone, was famous for singing this song. The song sounded so much like a spiritual for a long time, even to my adult life, I thought it was a Negro spiritual. And so that's what the first composition that you will hear. This is a little reference also to Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, a Negro spiritual included in this. Here's the blues, jazz idiom cue, da 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 da. Repeat it. Then you'll hear the walking bass, bloom, 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 where the bass is plucked as opposed to being bowed, pizzicato. Sliding into the small parts of the melody. Lamenting, longing, the longing of the slaves, da da da. It's a bright spot. Um, so that was Antonin Dvorak. We move next to Igor Stravinsky. Igor Stravinsky. And I say it that way because when I was 21, I found myself in Paris as a young man, unmarried. And at that time, there was a woman who I had been given a letter to see by my teacher. His name was Roland Hayes, who lived in Boston, in Brookline to be exact. And I had never heard of Nadia Boulanger, and I had never heard of Igor Stravinsky, and I had never heard of Francis Poulenc. I was 21, straight out of college, and had played most of the time while I was there. And but however, I had a talent, and I was partially serious about it, but I was also playing quite a bit. And I arrived in Paris with a jazz trumpeter, Leonard Goins, who does an enormous amount of music and jazz now. And we went down into the little parts of Paris, the left bank, to a place called Au Chac-y-Pêche, and then you would hear the music of Sidney Bechet, of Bud Powell, and so that was that jazz kind of life there. Jazz musicians were accepted, black jazz musicians were accepted in Paris and Europe, but not in the United States. And also, then I would leave that, and I would go to study with Pierre Bernac. And at my lessons sometimes would be Francis Poulenc, the famous composer. And I would go to Fontainebleau, which was Napoleon's palace, Napoleon's seat, where he said his tearful farewell to the palace guards before he went to Elba. And there was this woman, Nadia Boulanger, and also this man's next work, Igor Stravinsky, who had been born in St. Petersburg, which was Leningrad. And I noticed that these people were extremely revered. That is, that they were so revered that well, if you were standing there, that everyone would have a smile on their face, and no one would stop smiling for fear that one of these people would come and speak to them. So everyone was in a perpetual state of smile till your smiles hurt. And I was standing on the sidelines just looking at all of this because I'd never seen this kind of conduct before. And one of the men, Igor Stravinsky, there was this party, and then we all went into the concert hall, and there was an orchestra there, and Stravinsky went up to conduct his own work, which was called the Rake's Progress. And then this teacher, Nadia Boulanger, got up from her seat, and it was a big gold seat with Baroque cherubs and flowers and red cushion and sashes all down the side. And so she got up from her chair and she ran up to Stravinsky's podium, and she started banging on the desk, and everybody was quiet as a mouse. And she said, "Mr. Stravinsky, you are not conducting this work properly. You don't know how this music is to go." And it was his own work. And so she said that the first duty of the composer, of the conductor or the performer, is to represent as faithfully as possible what the composer had written, and he was not doing that. So we're going to hear, he is a composer of Russian origin, was an emigre to France, to Paris, worked earlier, some of his compositions, of course, the Rake's Progress, Petrushka, the ballet. He worked with Sergei Diaghilev, and the great Russian dancer Nijinsky danced in his pieces. And his father sang bass in the opera, so that was his early musical training. He also wrote a piano rag in 1920 for 11 instruments that included ragtime piano, such as Jelly Roll Morton played in early New Orleans jazz. Also in a movement in his composition called L'Histoire du Soldat, or the Soldier's Tale in 1918, you will hear African and Afro-American rhythms in these compositions. What we're going to hear today is a section from his Ebony concert, and you get the first word from Ebony. And then, as you heard in the last composition, which was written in minor, which sounds very sad and plaintive and melancholy. And you can think of Robert Frost's poem, To a Minor Bird, the bird that sings in minor. Or you can think of the love lyric that says, don't you make my love change from major, that is bright, to minor. So that's the whole function of this key system. So this concerto, Ebony Concerto for Clarinet and Jazz Band, it was written in 1945 on a commission from Woody Herman, who was a great jazz clarinetist. And Stravinsky today will be in this recording, will conduct his own music. Stravinsky was in the forefront of the new music, the rejection of tonality in the system that was brought about in the 18th and 19th century, where the single note functioned as a tonal center instead of the 12 notes of the octave, that all of them had equal importance. And so now you will hear Igor Stravinsky in his Ebony Concerto. Again. The next selection is by William Grant Still, who was born in 1895. This composer is an Afro-American composer. In 1945, Leopold Stokowski, a very great conductor associated with the Philadelphia Orchestra before Eugene Ormandy, just one of the great conductors of our time. He was born in 1895 in Woodsville, Mississippi, near the Louisiana border. His father died when he was just a few months old, and his mother took him to Little Rock, Arkansas. There he listened to his stepfather's opera recordings and jazz recordings, and soon after he began to take music lessons and then joined a string quartet at Wilberforce, Ohio, at the college called Wilberforce College, that's also known for producing Leontyne Price, the great opera singer from the Metropolitan Opera and the world. He studied with W.C. Handy, who was known to us as the father of the blues, the father of the blues. And I will sing one of his, thanks for coming, I'll see one of his compositions on the Monday night concert. It will be a Negro spiritual by W.C. Handy, but in this case he is known as the father of the blues. And he joined U.B. Blake's orchestra. U.B. Blake was a great composer. He wrote Shuffle Along, the music Shuffle Along. I'm just wild about Harry, and Harry's wild about me. He wrote that, and also Love will find a way, and so on, all these beautiful pieces. So he studied with U.B. Blake and toured with that company, and then began studying at the New England Conservatory in Boston with George Chadwick. And then in 1923 and 1925, he studied with a composer named Edgar Varese. And I hope you will listen to some of his music. It's very, very modern, or at least it was modern at one time to my ear. And I might tell you something. In the beginning, Beethoven's music sounded modern and strange. And my teacher always told me, and that's why I play these musical examples, she says, listen, listen, and perhaps you will be able to hear. So in this music, it requires not Beethoven and Haydn and this music and Mozart and Palestrina and all the rest, require repeated listenings to hear what is going on in the music. For I spoke about in the beginning about architecture being frozen music. You can look and see the turret. You can look and see the pediment. You can look and see the columns, and it stands right there before you frozen. But when we listen to music, it goes right by in that moment, and it's gone forever. And then you have to replay it to listen to those events that have occurred. So with Edgar Varese in New York City. Now, one of the things that you may not know, he wrote the music for Perry Mason, the Perry Mason TV show. He wrote the music for Perry Mason. He also wrote the music for Gunsmoke. Also for Gunsmoke. In this time in America, composers who were writing modern music, such as Eric Korngold, for example, who wrote an opera called Die Tote Stadt, or the Dead City. All of these people went to Hollywood, and they wrote musical scores, as did Aaron Copland, and Arnold Schoenberg moved to California. Stravinsky moved to California, so that was where the composer could receive money to live from, and also be able to support himself while he wrote his own compositions. So that you will hear that. This work was first appeared when Mr. Still appeared as guest conductor with the Los Angeles Philharmonic and also the New Orleans Philharmonic in 1955. And he was the first of his race to do so, or of our race to do so. He composed this piece at the request of Stokowski. And the Afro-American Symphony is the first symphony by a black composer, by an Afro-American composer. The first symphony written by a black man his name was Chevalier de Saint-Georges, Saint George, and who wrote a symphony, Opus 11, number 1, a century and a half earlier. And of course, so in the symphony you will hear it's rooted in the blues. I have some time. And I'd like to stop here when I say rooted in the blues. When the Africans came from Africa, principally the west coast of Africa, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the Ivory Coast, Togo, Benin, and Ghana, and so on. When they came, they didn't have anything to bring with them. That is, they came packed in slave ships like sardines are packed, but in not as much oil. But in any case, there was no slipping on the boat. In any case, what they brought with them was their own heritage, and that included the concept of syncopation. That is, when you hear a regular beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the syncopation is the deliberate upsetting of that normal beat. So you hear ba, 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 da, ba, 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 da, ba, 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 da, 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 ba. And so that's syncopation. They also brought with them a concept called call and response. And that's when the leader sings a call, or the instruments play a call, and then a group or a second group of instruments play the response. And so if I sang to you, when Israel was in Egypt's land, and you would sing, let my people go, that would be the call, and then you would have the response. And they brought with them also the concept of improvisation. That is, to improvise, to create a melody and improvise the composition while you're standing there on the spot, extempore. Of course, they pulled it off from a whole collection of prearranged patterns, and so it just wasn't done. But they knew exactly what they were doing, and also an extremely complex rhythmical system. Now, they brought with them also slides and slurs and scoops and also these kinds of sounds. Now, when they brought that here, and the white Protestant or the white settlers brought with them the European musical notation system, that of the major minor scales, the sharps and the flats, and the staff and the rests and the keys and so on, and the diatonic scale, da 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 dee da 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 dum. There was no place in the scale for those sounds that they had brought with them themselves. Okay, so they began to be called flattened pitches or blue notes. I put it into my horn till it was born into a blue note. Then I nursed it and rehearsed it and gave out a tune, and that was called the birth of the blues. And so you get this blue note in there. And so that becomes flattened scales, which becomes the music of jazz. And then coming along with Alban Berg and Stravinsky and these composers who were doing the 12-tone music in Vienna, who emigrated and came, or some who came to America. When you have this fusion of European folk music and all the different nationalities from all the various countries in Europe coming and meeting into America, and you have what is created is a music called jazz and blues, and music that is distinctly different, and our own classical music that is heard now in concert halls throughout the civilized and uncivilized world. So, whatever that I had to add that. Okay, now I'd like you to listen to William Grant Still's Afro-American Symphony. Sounds like Eric. There's the main melody. There's the repetition of that melody. Of course, we have the Indians as well. Here you hear the blues. Those are the blue notes in the blues. Ba-da-dum-bum. There's the call and response. There's a little syncopated melody, riding to town. Da dee, hear this da, dee da, yeah, the banjo, dee da, da da dee da dee da 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 dee da dum bum bum. There's the syncopation. Of course, that's George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. Time won't permit. I'd just like to close by saying that after World War I, this is my textbook that I teach out of, so you can see what kind of shape it's in. When my music begins to look like that I sing from, then I know the piece. But I want to thank you for coming. It was a really great experience to be here at Greenfield Community College again. And it was so wonderful to see all the flyers up and the posters up everywhere. It makes me feel like a star. I remember going to, no, really, you don't. I remember going to the great German city of Bayreuth, and also, it was Wiesbaden, but I did sing in Bayreuth as well. And at 12 o'clock and at midnight, my accompanist and I were walking through the streets of Wiesbaden, putting up placards and signs about the arrival of this great international singer. So it's so wonderful. It's so wonderful to come here and see everything has been done so beautifully. And you've been a great audience and a wonderful class. Thank you.